At dawn on the 25th of October, 1944, a group of American sailors looked out across the water off the island of Samar and saw something that should not have been there. Rising over the horizon were the pagoda masts of Japanese warships, not one or two, a whole fleet. At the center of it steamed the largest battleship ever built, a steel giant whose guns could throw shells that weighed more than a ton across more than 20 miles of open sea. Behind her came more battleships, heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. It was one of the most powerful surface fleets Japan had ever put to sea. And it had appeared exactly where no American admiral believed it could be. The ships facing it were not built for this. They were small, they were slow. Their hulls were thin enough that a single large shell could pass clean through without slowing down. They had been designed to escort convoys and to fly aircraft over soldiers on the beach, not to trade fire with battleships. Their crews knew it. Every man on those decks understood, in the first few seconds, exactly what they were looking at. And then the small ships did the one thing no one watching would have predicted. They turned, not away from the Japanese fleet, toward it. Thin, lightly armed vessels began driving straight at the guns of the most feared warships in the Pacific, closing the distance on purpose, sailing directly into fire that could tear them apart in a single salvo. By every measure that mattered, they should have run. They should have been swept from the sea in minutes. What happened instead became one of the strangest and most desperate actions in the history of naval warfare. How does a fleet of the world's most powerful warships end up being charged by ships a fraction of their size? To understand that, you have to understand how both fleets came to be in that stretch of water on that particular morning, and why the men in the small ships believed they had no other choice. By the autumn of 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned against Japan. Island by island, American forces had fought their way closer to the Japanese home islands. Now the target was the Philippines. Retaking those islands would cut Japan off from the oil and the resources of the South, the supplies that kept its war machine alive. For Japan, losing the Philippines meant losing the war. So when American troops began landing on the island of Leyte, the Japanese Navy gambled almost everything on a single enormous plan to destroy the invasion before it could take hold. The plan was complicated, and it depended entirely on deception. Japan no longer had the aircraft or the trained pilots to fight the American carriers head-on. What it still had were battleships. The idea was to lure the strongest part of the American fleet away, then slip those battleships past the weakened defenders and fall on the transport ships that were unloading troops and cargo in the Gulf. Those transports were the soft heart of the entire operation. Sink them, and the men already ashore would be stranded, and the invasion would collapse. The bait was a group of Japanese aircraft carriers sent north, almost empty of planes, with one job: get noticed, draw the American admiral away. And it worked, completely. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet with its fast carriers and its own battleships, took the bait and raced north to destroy those carriers, convinced he was chasing the real threat. As he went, he left the door behind him wide open. A narrow passage called the San Bernardino Strait, the gateway to the invasion fleet, was left with nothing guarding it. And through that gate, in the darkness, came the Japanese battleships. The only thing standing between them and the transports was never meant to be a last line of defense. It was a group of small ships known by the code name Taffy 3. 13 vessels in all, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. It is worth understanding just how badly matched they were. The escort carriers were built quickly and cheaply, often on the hulls of merchant ships. The sailors who served on them joked bitterly that the letters in their designation stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. They could barely make 18 knots. Their armor was almost nothing at all. Each one carried a single gun on its stern for defense and a small number of aircraft. The destroyers and destroyer escorts that guarded them were faster, but they were tiny compared to what was coming. Their crews called them tin cans because their thin steel offered almost no protection at all. Their largest guns measured 5 inches across. Now set that against the fleet bearing down on them. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. At the head of it steamed the battleship Yamato, the heaviest and most powerful warship ever constructed. carrying guns that dwarfed anything the Americans had afloat in those waters. A single one of her main shells weighed more than a ton. The mismatch was almost beyond belief. On paper, it was not a battle at all. It was an execution waiting to happen. When the Japanese fleet appeared out of the morning haze, the Americans were caught completely by surprise. The commander of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, admitted afterward that his first thought was that his entire force was about to be destroyed. Enormous splashes began rising around his ships as the Japanese battleships opened fire from miles away, the water erupting in tall colored geysers as each ship marked its own shells with dye to see where they landed. Sprague did the only things he could. He turned his slow carriers away, ordered every available aircraft into the air, and told his ships to lay down smoke, a thick screen of black and white to hide behind. Then he sent out a call for help in plain language, a call that carried across the fleet. But smoke and prayers were not going to be enough. The Japanese ships were faster. They were closing, and in a matter of minutes they would be within range to sink the carriers one by one. Someone had to buy time. Someone had to make the enemy slow down, turn, scatter, do anything at all except keep charging straight at the vulnerable flat tops. That was when the tin cans went to war. The first to move was a destroyer named the Johnston, under the command of a man named Ernest Evans. Evans was a career naval officer of Cherokee and Creek descent, and when his ship had first gone to sea, he had made his crew a promise. This was going to be a fighting ship. It would sail into danger, not away from it, and any man who did not want that could leave while he still could. On the morning off Samar, Evans kept that promise. Without waiting for orders, he turned his small ship out of the formation and drove it straight toward the Japanese line. Alone. A single destroyer running at full speed toward a wall of battleships and cruisers. The Johnston closed the range through the shell splashes, her crew firing her small guns as fast as they could load them, and then launched her torpedoes at a heavy cruiser. The torpedoes struck home. The cruiser was hit hard, its bow torn open, and it fell out of the fight. For a moment, one tiny ship had drawn blood from a giant. Then the giants answered. Enormous shells from a Japanese battleship slammed into the Johnston. The blasts tore through her, wrecking engines, knocking out power, killing men across her decks. In seconds, she went from a fighting ship to a burning wreck barely able to steer. Evans himself was wounded, part of his hand gone, but he stayed on his feet and kept giving orders. And against all reason, the Johnston kept fighting. Her surviving crew brought power back to some of her guns and turned her back toward the enemy. What the Johnston did was no longer a lone act of defiance. Sprague had now given the order that everyone had known was coming and had dreaded. The small boys, the destroyers, and the destroyer escorts were to attack. All of them. Torpedo runs against the battle line to break up the Japanese formation and force it to maneuver. It was, in plain terms, an order to charge the most powerful fleet in the Pacific with the smallest ships in the American Navy. And one after another they went. The destroyer Hole drove in toward a battleship and a column of cruisers, firing and launching torpedoes to force them off course. She was hit again and again, struck by dozens of shells, until she was a shattered hulk that could no longer answer her helm. She kept firing until she rolled over and sank, taking most of her crew down with her. The destroyer Heermann charged in alongside her, weaving through the smoke and the shellfire, and did something that still sounds impossible. She launched her torpedoes at the Yamato itself, the mightiest battleship in the world. The torpedoes ran straight toward the giant, and to avoid them, the Yamato was forced to turn away and run, steaming north to keep the torpedo tracks off her side. For several critical minutes, the most powerful warship in the entire battle was pointed in the wrong direction, sailing away from the fight, hemmed in by her own caution and the wakes of torpedoes fired by a ship a tiny fraction of her size. The admiral commanding the whole Japanese force was aboard that battleship. For those minutes, he was carried away from the very battle he was trying to win. Every torpedo dodged, every course change forced on the enemy, every minute the Japanese spent maneuvering instead of firing was a minute the carriers used to crawl a little farther away. The clock was ticking. The men in the tin cans could not hear it, but they were spending the only thing they had left to spend, which was their own lives. To understand why men would do this, why they would sail directly into fire that could not be survived, you have to look past the ships and see what was behind them. Just over the horizon, in the waters of Leyte Gulf, sat the invasion fleet. Transport ships packed with supplies, landing craft, and on the island itself, more than 100,000 American soldiers who had just come ashore and who were depending on those ships for everything they needed to stay alive. If the Japanese battleships broke through Taffy 3, there was almost nothing left behind to stop them. They would fall on the transports in the Gulf and turn the landing into a massacre. The men ashore would be cut off. Thousands could die. The entire campaign to retake the Philippines could unravel in a single morning. Sprague and his captains understood this with terrible clarity. They could not outrun the Japanese. They could not outgun them. The only thing they could do was throw themselves into the path and make the enemy pay for every mile, delay him, confuse him, and pray that their sacrifice bought enough time. It was not a battle they expected to win. It was a battle they intended to survive just long enough to matter. If a story like this is the reason you are here, then take a moment and subscribe to Untold War Archives. Every week we go back into the moments the history books rush past, the forgotten orders and the impossible stands that decided far more than most people ever realize. Now back to the water off Samar, where the fighting was about to reach its most desperate point. By the middle of the morning, the sea off Samar had become a chaos of smoke, burning ships and crossing shell fire, and into that chaos sailed the smallest ship yet to make a stand. The Samuel B. Roberts was not even a full destroyer. She was a destroyer escort, smaller still, more lightly armed, built for hunting submarines far from the front line. Her captain, Robert Copeland, gathered his crew and told them the truth without softening it. They were going into a fight against overwhelming odds, a fight from which they should not expect to return. Then he took his little ship into the middle of the Japanese cruiser line. The Roberts fired her torpedoes and then closed to a range so short she was almost among the enemy, trading gunfire with heavy cruisers many times her size. Her two small guns fired again and again, hundreds of rounds pouring out, her gunners working until the barrels were nearly worn through, striking the towering warships around her at point-blank range. For a while the impossible held. A ship built to chase submarines stood toe-to-toe with cruisers and hurt them. Then a battleship found her. The heavy shells that struck the Roberts tore her open. Her power failed, her guns fell silent, and she began to go down. Her crew fought to save her and could not. As she sank, some of her gunners were still trying to load their weapons by hand. She had fought, as men remembered afterward, like a ship many times her size. The Johnston, already broken and burning from the battleship hits she had taken, still would not stop. For more than 2 hours she fought on, drawing fire away from the carriers, trading shots with cruisers and then with a column of Japanese destroyers that closed in around her. Slowly they surrounded her and pounded her from every side until she could no longer fight back. Evans finally gave the order to abandon ship, and the Johnston rolled over and sank beneath the smoke. According to survivors who watched from the water, as she went down, one of the Japanese destroyer captains stood on his deck and saluted the ship he had just helped to kill. Whether the account is exactly true or not, it captured something real. Even the enemy seemed to understand they had just watched something extraordinary. While the tin cans fought and died at close range, the battle was raging in the air and among the carriers as well. The aircraft Sprague had launched, along with planes from the other groups nearby, attacked the Japanese ships without pause. Many of them had no bombs or torpedoes left, or had never been armed to attack ships at all, having been loaded to support troops on the beach. So they made their runs anyway. Empty, diving on battleships and cruisers with nothing to drop, forcing the huge ships to turn and dodge attacks that could do them no harm, buying still more time through nothing but nerve. The carriers themselves were not spared. One of them, the Gambier Bay, was caught by Japanese gunfire and pounded until she sank, the only American aircraft carrier lost to enemy shells in the entire war. The others ran under their own smoke, some of them firing their single-stern guns back at the cruisers chasing them, and at least one of their shells is credited with striking a heavy cruiser. an almost unthinkable result for a ship of that kind. Small ships and slow ships, throwing everything they had at an enemy that should have overwhelmed them in the opening minutes. The charges and the endless air attacks had cost the Japanese as well. 3 of their heavy cruisers were sunk in the chaos off Samar, battered by torpedoes and bombs and by the reckless courage of ships that should never have been able to touch them. The giants had bled after all. And then, at the exact moment when the Japanese fleet held every advantage, when the carriers were within reach and the American defenders were being torn apart, the Japanese commander did something that has been argued over ever since. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and turn away. To this day, historians debate exactly why. His formation had been scattered by the relentless charges and the air attacks. Several of his heavy cruisers had been sunk or crippled in the confusion. He had received conflicting reports, and some accounts suggest he had come to believe he was fighting not a handful of small escorts, but a much larger force of fleet carriers, with more powerful ships closing in. Fearing a trap, worried about further air attacks, and with his ships strung out and disordered, he made the decision to withdraw. He was tantalizingly close. Just beyond him lay the transports he had been sent to destroy, almost undefended. The path was nearly open, and he turned around and steamed away, leaving the invasion fleet untouched. The tiny ships and the men who had thrown themselves away to slow him down had done the one thing that had seemed impossible. They had made the most powerful fleet in the Pacific flinch. But the horror of that morning was not finished. Even as the surface battle wound down, a new kind of attack came in over Taffy 3. Japanese aircraft deliberately trying to crash themselves into the American ships in one of the first organized suicide attacks of the Pacific War. One of them struck the escort carrier St. Lo, which had survived the battleships only to be torn apart by fire and explosions and sink. Men who had lived through the impossible in the morning did not live to see the afternoon. When it was over, the cost was staggering for such a small force. Taffy 3 had lost 2 of its escort carriers and 3 of its escorts, the Hole, the Johnston, and the Samuel B. Roberts, all sunk beneath the waves. More than 1,000 American sailors were dead or dying. For many of them, the sinking was not the end of the ordeal. Hundreds of survivors were left floating in the open sea, clinging to rafts and to wreckage and to each other. Through a series of tragic mistakes, rescue did not reach them for nearly 2 days. In that time, men died of their wounds, of exposure, and of thirst, and some were taken by sharks drawn to the blood in the water. Sailors who had faced down battleships and lived slipped away one by one in the dark ocean, waiting for ships that were slow to come. Ernest Evans, the captain of the Johnston, the man who had turned his ship toward the enemy first, was never found. He went down somewhere in that water with the men he had led into the fight. For what he did that morning, he was awarded his nation's highest honor, the first man of Native American heritage in the United States Navy ever to receive it. He never knew that it had been given. Decades later, long after the war was over, explorers finally located the wrecks of the ships that had made that stand. They lay more than 4 miles beneath the surface among the deepest shipwrecks ever discovered by human beings, resting in silence in the black water where they had fallen. Still on station, still guarding the same patch of sea, the standoff Samar is remembered not because it made sense, and not because anyone planned it, but because of what it revealed. A group of ships that were never meant to fight battleships chose to fight them anyway, because behind them were men who would die if they did not. They could not win. They knew it, and they charged regardless. It is easy looking back to turn a story like this into a simple tale of glory. It was not simple. It was terror and confusion and men making impossible choices in a few desperate hours, then paying for those choices in the cold water afterward. But stripped of everything else, one fact remains. When the largest warships in the world came for the soldiers on that beach, the only thing standing in the way was a handful of small ships and the men aboard them. And when the moment came, those men did not step aside. The most powerful fleet in the Pacific turned around that day. It was not driven off by bigger guns or heavier armor. It was driven off by sailors in thin steel hulls who decided that some things are worth more than survival. and then proved it in the space of a single morning, off the coast of a Philippine island most of them had never heard of before that week, and none of them would ever forget.